The boy shared his only snack with a man who appeared to be homeless. The next day, a luxurious car stopped in front of his house, and when the door opened, he was left speechless. Jake woke up to the faint light seeping through the torn curtain in his small room. He could hear his mother already up, her voice muffled as she spoke on the phone. It wasn't hard to guess what it was about. Rent was overdue. Jake slipped out of bed quietly, trying not to wake his sister, who was still curled up on the mattress next to his. The kitchen was narrow, barely enough room for him and his mother to move at the same time. His mom, Susan, had her back turned to him, her shoulders tensed as she ended the call. Jake pretended not to notice and focused on making his lunch. He unwrapped a loaf of bread that was starting to harden around the edges and reached for the peanut butter. The sandwich he made was thin, just enough for lunch, nothing extra. He wrapped it in a piece of waxed paper, tucking it carefully into his old lunchbox. "Morning, Jake," his mom said, forcing a smile. Her eyes looked tired. "Morning, Mom," Jake replied, glancing up briefly before continuing. He tried to sound cheerful, like everything was fine. The worry was always there, hanging around like a shadow, but he knew she was trying, and so would he. He grabbed his lunchbox, slipped on his sneakers, and headed out the door. The air was cool, the kind that stung just a little but promised it would warm up later. He looked down the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood, houses with chipped paint and worn fences lining both sides. Jake walked briskly, hearing his own footsteps echo slightly on the empty street. When he was about halfway to school, he saw him, an old man sitting against the side of a closed store, his back against the rough brick wall. The man's face was thin, his clothes even more worn than Jake's. His eyes were half closed, his hands resting limply in his lap. Something about the way he was sitting made Jake slow down. He looked at the man's face, the lines etched into his skin. He looked tired in a way Jake had seen before, on his mom's face. Jake hesitated. He could feel the weight of the lunchbox in his hand. His stomach growled, reminding him that the thin sandwich inside was all he had until dinner. He thought about just walking past, about how much he needed that food, but something kept his feet glued to the pavement. The man opened his eyes slightly, his gaze drifting up to meet Jake's for a moment. Jake swallowed, feeling a tight knot in his throat. He didn't have much, but neither did this man. Jake walked over and kneeled down beside him. The old man looked at him, eyes clouded and uncertain. Jake opened his lunchbox, carefully unwrapped the sandwich, and held it out. He didn't say anything for a moment. His hands felt heavy, his heart pounding in his ears. "Here," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need this more than I do." The man blinked, his hands trembling a little as he took the sandwich. He looked at Jake, a flicker of something, maybe gratitude, crossing his face. He nodded, not speaking, his lips parting slightly as if words were too difficult to come by. Jake stood up, wiping his palms against his jeans, as if brushing away the hesitation that had almost stopped him. He turned and started walking towards school again, his stomach still empty, but his steps somehow feeling lighter. The rest of the walk was quiet. Jake arrived at school just as the bell rang. He slipped into his seat, staring at the chalkboard. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the old man. He wondered if that sandwich had been enough, if it had helped. The teacher's voice was a dull buzz in the background, and Jake found himself glancing around the room. Kids were pulling out packed lunches, snacks, bright and colorful, laid out in front of them, his stomach twisted, and he tried not to think about it. During lunch, Jake watched the other kids as they ate. He could hear them talk about weekend plans and their new gadgets, things that felt worlds away from where he lived. He thought about what his mom would make for dinner. It wouldn't be much, maybe soup if they still had enough canned veggies left. He clenched his jaw, trying to focus on anything else. School finally ended, and Jake walked home slowly. The neighborhood looked the same as always. The houses, the cracked pavement, the sound of distant traffic. When he turned the corner to his street, he could see the landlord's car parked in front of their building. His mom was standing there, arms crossed, her expression tense as she talked to the landlord. Jake watched from a distance, his stomach churning. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were talking about. It was about the rent again, the threat of eviction, the same thing that had loomed over them for months. His mom looked over her shoulder and saw Jake. She gave a small nod, signaling him to stay back. Jake didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he walked to the corner of the building, leaning against it and waiting. He tried to tune out their voices, but he caught a few words. Payment. Overdue. Last chance. The phrases made his heart pound harder. After a while, the landlord left, his car pulling away with a sputter. His mom turned towards him, her eyes red. She gave him a weary smile. Let's go inside, Jake. They entered the apartment, and Jake put down his empty lunchbox, his mother watching him carefully. Did you eat, Jake? He looked up, trying to force a smile. Yeah, I did. Good, she said, nodding, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. Dinner that night was quiet. His sister Anna giggled about something that happened in kindergarten, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. His mom smiled at her, nodding and adding to her stories. Jake watched them both, trying to absorb the warmth of the moment, despite everything else. Later that night, when his sister was asleep, Jake lay in his small bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the old man, of his mom's tired eyes, of the landlord's threats. He turned on his side, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. He'd done what he could today, even if it was just a small gesture. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough for now. The morning sunlight slipped through the curtains, creating a dim glow that barely reached the corners of their small apartment. Jake rolled out of bed, careful not to wake his sister. He could hear the familiar clatter of dishes in the kitchen and knew his mom was already up, probably trying to put something together for breakfast. The scent of instant coffee was in the air, a bittersweet reminder of the mornings that never seemed to change. He walked into the kitchen, greeted by the sight of his mother leaning against the counter, her fingers wrapped around a mug. Her face was turned away, but Jake could see her staring blankly out the window. She snapped out of it when she noticed him. "Morning, Jake," she said, trying for a cheerful tone, but her voice had a hollow edge to it. There was no hiding the tiredness in her eyes. "Morning, Mom." Jake looked around for breakfast, his gaze landing on a single loaf of bread and the jar of peanut butter. He picked them up and started making a couple of slices, just enough to share between him, his mom, and Anna. "We're going to be all right, you know that?" Susan said, her voice soft, as she watched him spread the peanut butter. She reached out, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We always figure things out." Jake nodded without looking up. He could see the faint hope she was trying to offer, but he also knew how fragile that hope felt. They'd been balancing on the edge for as long as he could remember, trying to make ends meet every month without slipping. The landlord's visit yesterday had shaken something inside him, making the fear of losing their home feel more real. When Anna woke up, they ate their breakfast quietly. Anna chattered on, oblivious to the heaviness around her. Jake tried to smile, laughing at her stories, but he could see his mom's distant gaze, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Once breakfast was done, Jake grabbed his school bag, giving his mom a quick hug before heading out the door. The air was crisp, but he barely noticed it. He just kept thinking about the landlord's warning, how they only had a bit of time left to pay. It felt like a weight on his chest, one that wouldn't go away. He trudged along the worn sidewalks, watching the old houses pass by, their fences crooked, lawns unkempt. He knew his neighborhood wasn't the kind people talked about positively. Most folks were just like them, struggling to keep up with bills and make sure there was enough to eat. Every time he saw someone else walking to work or rushing their kids to school, he could see the same kind of worry in their eyes. Jake's school wasn't much different. It was small, the walls lined with paint that had started to peel long ago. As he walked to his first class, he overheard some of his classmates talking. "Man, my dad's getting me a new bike this weekend. The last one broke and I've been waiting forever," one kid was saying. "Lucky," another replied. "My dad says I gotta wait until Christmas." Jake couldn't help but listen, a small pang hitting him in the gut. He thought of his own bike, rusty, with a chain that fell off every few blocks. There were no promises of new things for him. Everything he had was something they managed to fix or patch up, and even then, it felt like it was always on the brink of falling apart. In class, Jake struggled to focus. The teacher's voice blurred into the background as his mind wandered. He thought about how his mom was probably at her second job right now, cleaning someone's house. He imagined her tired hands, scrubbing floors, and the way she would come home exhausted, her fingers sore from all the work. He wanted to help, but he was just a kid. What could he do? Lunch rolled around and Jake sat in the corner of the cafeteria, staring at the empty table in front of him. He watched other kids open their bags, chips, fruit, juice boxes, things that seemed like luxuries. His stomach growled and he tried to ignore it. Instead, he thought of the old man from the day before, wondering if that sandwich had helped even a little. "Hey, Jake," someone called, and he looked up. It was Mark, a kid from his class. Mark was carrying a tray loaded with food, pizza, apples, a carton of milk. "Where's your lunch?" Jake shrugged. "Forgot it at home," he lied, forcing a smile. "Man, that sucks." Mark's eyes lingered on him for a moment, like he wasn't sure if he believed Jake, but then he just nodded. "See you later, I guess." Jake watched Mark walk away, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He wished things could be different. He wished he didn't have to lie or pretend that he wasn't hungry. But this was how it was. He couldn't change it. Not today, anyway. After school, Jake walked home slowly, his stomach rumbling. The old man wasn't in his usual spot, and Jake wondered where he'd gone. He hoped he was all right, wherever he was. When Jake got home, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers rubbing her temples. The landlord's visit had clearly left its mark. She looked up when Jake came in, her smile small but real this time. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school?" she asked. "Good," Jake said, shrugging off his backpack and pulling out a chair to sit next to her. He could see the stack of bills on the table, some with bright red lettering that made his stomach sink. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His mother's eyes softened, her hand reaching out to brush his hair back. "We're fighters, Jake. We've always managed, haven't we?" Jake nodded, but the worry still sat in his chest. He could see it on her face, too. She was trying to be strong, but the fear was there, right beneath the surface. That evening, as they ate dinner, thin soup with bread that was almost stale, Jake could see the effort his mother made to keep things light. Anna's laughter filled the room, and Jake couldn't help but smile. He wanted to believe his mom's words. He wanted to think that somehow they would make it work. Later that night, after his sister was asleep, Jake sat in his small room, staring at the window. He could see the flicker of lights from the apartments across the street. The world felt big, and he felt small. The weight of everything, school, home, money, pressed down on him until it felt like he couldn't breathe. He thought back to the old man, sitting alone with nothing. Jake had given him his lunch, but what had it really changed? Maybe nothing. But at least he'd tried. At least for a moment he'd been able to make someone's day just a little bit easier. Jake took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to figure things out. He didn't know how, but he had to believe there was a way. He had to. The morning began like any other. Jake got out of bed, carefully tiptoeing past his sister, who was still lost in sleep. He could hear the rattle of dishes in the kitchen and the sound of water running in the sink. He walked in to see his mother rinsing out some cups. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her eyes looked tired, but focused. "Morning, Mom," Jake said. "Morning, sweetheart," she answered with a tired smile. She glanced at the small loaf of bread left on the counter, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Looks like we've still got enough for toast today." Jake nodded, reaching for the bread. They worked silently, making what they could. Breakfast was modest, just enough to put something in their stomachs before the day began. Anna woke up a few minutes later, bounding into the kitchen with a bright, "Good morning." Jake smiled at her energy. Even when things were tough, his sister always had that glow about her, a kind of innocence that made everything seem a little less heavy. They ate quickly, and Jake got ready for school. He slipped his feet into his sneakers, hearing the soft squeak as the worn rubber scraped against the floor. He grabbed his lunchbox, still empty since yesterday, and made his way out the door, giving his mother a small wave. "See you later, Mom." "Be careful, Jake," she called back, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. Jake walked down the same familiar streets, feeling the cool air against his face. The sun was rising, painting the rooftops in soft orange light. He liked these early morning walks, where everything seemed quiet, where he had a moment to himself before the world fully woke up. He was halfway down the block when he heard it, a low, humming noise. He turned his head, eyes narrowing as he saw a car pulling up to the curb. It was sleek, shiny, unlike anything that usually showed up in his neighborhood. Jake watched it, slowing his pace. It came to a stop right in front of his apartment building, the engine purring for a moment before it cut off. Jake's heart thudded as the door opened, and someone stepped out. A man, dressed in a sharp suit, his hair combed neatly back. For a second, Jake didn't recognize him. But then the man looked up, his eyes meeting Jake's, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was him. The old man from yesterday, the one he'd given his sandwich to. But he looked completely different now. He was clean-shaven, his hair neat, his clothes perfectly pressed. He didn't look like the man Jake had seen slumped against the wall. He looked important. Jake stood frozen for a second, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The man gave him a small nod, then turned to look up at the building. Jake's mother had come to the window, her face twisted in confusion. Jake hurried forward, his stomach churning. He reached the building just as the man looked back at him, a small smile on his face. "Jake, right?" the man asked, his voice deep but kind. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah. What are you doing here?" The man glanced up at the window, then back at Jake. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday. You gave me something when you didn't have much yourself. That's rare." Jake blinked, unsure what to say. His mouth felt dry. You're welcome." The man smiled again, his gaze softening. "I'd like to talk to you and your mom, if that's all right." Before Jake could respond, his mother stepped out of the building, her face a mix of confusion and worry. "Jake? Who's this?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the man. The man took a step forward, his posture respectful. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry for the surprise visit. My name is Walter. Your son did something very kind yesterday. I wanted to thank him properly." Jake's mother frowned, looking between Jake and Walter. "Thank him? I don't understand." Jake swallowed, glancing at his mom. I gave him my lunch yesterday. He was sitting by the store." Susan's eyebrows shot up, her gaze snapping back to Walter. She was clearly trying to piece it all together, and Jake could see the suspicion in her eyes. "I see," she said slowly. "And now you're here. Why, exactly?" Walter smiled, though there was a seriousness in his eyes. I know this might seem strange, but I want to help. Jake showed me kindness when I needed it, and I want to return that kindness. Jake's mother looked at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. What kind of help are we talking about? Walter gestured to the car. I'd like to discuss it inside if you don't mind. It's nothing extravagant, just an opportunity. Jake could feel his mom's hesitation, the way she was weighing the situation in her head. He could feel it too. Strangers didn't just show up offering help. Not here. Not for people like them. But there was something sincere in the way Walter spoke, in the way he looked at them. After a long moment, Susan nodded. All right, let's go inside. They walked back into the apartment, Jake holding the door open as they stepped into the small living room. Walter looked around, his gaze taking in the worn furniture, the cracked walls. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, as if to himself. Please sit down, Susan said, gesturing to the couch. Walter sat down, his posture relaxed but respectful. Jake and his mom sat across from him, waiting. Walter took a breath, looking at Jake. Yesterday, when you gave me that sandwich, I was testing something, he said. Jake's eyebrows furrowed. Testing? Walter nodded. I know it sounds strange, but I've spent a long time wondering if people are still capable of genuine kindness. I have more than I need, and I've been trying to find a way to make a difference. What you did yesterday showed me that there are still people who care, even when they don't have much themselves. Jake felt his face flush. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't done anything special, not really. It was just a sandwich. I'd like to help you and your family, Walter continued. Not just with money, though I know things are tight, but with opportunities. I'd like to sponsor Jake's education, give him the chance to have a better future. And I'd like to help you, Mrs. Thompson, with finding a better job, something stable. Jake's mother's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. Sponsor his education? Help me find a job? Walter nodded, his eyes sincere. I know it's a lot to take in, and I don't expect an answer right now. I just want you to know that the offer is there. No strings attached. I just want to help. The room was silent for a long moment. Jake could feel his mom's gaze on him, her eyes searching his face. He looked back at her, unsure. It was too much to process all at once. They'd spent so long trying to make it work on their own, to just scrape by. And now, here was this man, offering them a way out. But it felt almost too good to be true. Susan cleared her throat, her voice shaky. I don't know what to say. Walter gave a small smile. Take your time. I understand. I know it's a lot. Jake looked at his mom, then back at Walter. There was a knot in his stomach, a mix of hope and fear. He didn't know if they could trust this man, but he also knew that they didn't have many other options. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the break they needed. Can we think about it? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter nodded, his expression gentle. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll leave my card here. You can call me anytime. He stood up, handing the card to Susan, who took it with trembling fingers. Walter gave them one last nod before heading towards the door. He paused, looking back at Jake. You did a good thing yesterday, Jake. Don't ever forget that. Jake swallowed, watching as Walter left the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. The room fell silent, and Jake looked at his mother. She was staring at the card in her hand, her expression a mix of hope and fear. What do you think, Mom? Jake asked quietly. Susan looked at him, her eyes softening. I think maybe this is something we need to think about carefully. But maybe it's a chance. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. It was a chance. And maybe, just maybe, it was the one they'd been waiting for. The next morning was quieter than usual. Jake woke up and walked into the kitchen, finding his mom already awake, staring down at the business card Walter had left behind. The small white rectangle looked out of place among the clutter of bills and papers on their kitchen table. "Hey, Mom," Jake said softly, pulling her attention away. She blinked and looked up at him, her eyes carrying the weight of sleepless hours. "Hey, sweetheart," she replied. She put the card aside, offering a faint smile. "Ready for school?" Jake nodded. He wanted to ask if she'd thought any more about Walter's offer, but he didn't. The words were stuck somewhere in the back of his throat. It was clear she had been thinking about it a lot. "Get your things. I'll walk you out," Susan said, rising from her chair. Jake picked up his school bag, and together they walked out of the apartment. The air outside was crisp, and Jake saw his breath clouding in front of him. His mom stopped at the front stoop, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Jake," she began, her voice hesitant. He looked up, waiting. "I've decided to call Walter. I'm not sure if it's the right thing, but maybe it's worth a try." Jake nodded, a part of him relieved and a part of him still unsure. "Yeah, I think it could help, Mom." She squeezed his shoulder, her eyes softening. "We'll see, okay? We'll figure it out together." With that, Jake started down the street, the chill morning air waking him up as he walked. School felt like a blur today. His thoughts kept drifting back to Walter and the idea of everything changing. Was this really going to be their way out? When lunchtime rolled around, Jake made his way to the cafeteria, sitting at the far end of a table. He had no lunch today, and he tried not to look at the other kids with their trays. He was used to ignoring hunger when he needed to. "Hey, Jake," a familiar voice called, and Jake looked up to see Mark walking over, his tray in hand. He slid into the seat across from Jake, his eyes curious. "So what was with that fancy car I saw outside your place yesterday?" Jake blinked, surprised. He didn't realize Mark, or anyone else, had seen. It was just someone visiting." Mark raised an eyebrow, a grin playing on his lips. "Just someone, huh? Looked pretty important to me." Jake shifted in his seat, not really wanting to talk about it. He wasn't sure what to say. "It's complicated." Mark leaned back, taking a bite of his pizza. "Come on, you can tell me. Everyone's talking about it. Some guy in a suit showing up in a fancy car. People think you hit the jackpot or something." Jake frowned, his stomach twisting. He hated the idea of people talking about him. "It's not like that," he said quietly. Mark shrugged, the grin never leaving his face. "Well, if you're going to be rich now, don't forget about us little people, all right?" Jake clenched his jaw, the words stinging. He didn't want this. He didn't ask for people to notice or think anything about him. He just wanted things to get a little easier at home. After school, Jake walked home with his head down, feeling the weight of people's eyes on him. The whispers had spread faster than he thought. Kids who never even looked at him before were glancing his way, their expressions curious or envious. He could feel their judgment, their assumptions about what was happening, and he hated it. When he got home, his mom was waiting, the phone in her hand. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of hope and anxiety. "I called him, Jake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's coming by tomorrow to talk things through." Jake nodded, dropping his bag by the door. "That's good, right?" Susan gave him a shaky smile. "I think so. I hope so." The rest of the evening was quiet, filled with a sense of anticipation that made the small apartment feel even smaller. Dinner was simple, and they ate in near silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jake noticed his mom kept looking over at the business card, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. The next day, Jake walked to school feeling a strange mix of anxiety and hope. He kept his head down, trying to ignore the whispers and glances. But it seemed like the story had grown legs of its own. By lunchtime, it felt like everyone had some version of it. As he was sitting in the cafeteria, a group of kids walked by, one of them snickering. "Hey, Jake, when's the limo picking you up, huh?" The kid jeered, his friends laughing. Jake kept his head down, his face heating up. He clenched his fists under the table, trying to ignore them. He knew it didn't matter what they thought, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Mark came over, dropping his tray onto the table. "Ignore them, man," he said, though he couldn't help the grin that tugged at his lips. "They're just jealous. Seriously, though, if you're getting out of this place, that's pretty awesome." Jake forced a smile, but it felt empty. "Yeah, maybe." Mark shrugged. "You know, not everyone gets a shot like that. You're lucky, dude. Don't waste it." Jake didn't reply. The word lucky sat in his chest like a stone. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like a spotlight had been turned on him, and he didn't know how to escape it. After school, Jake hurried home, wanting nothing more than to be away from everyone. When he got to the apartment, Walter's car was already parked out front, its sleek black paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake's mom was standing by the door talking to Walter, her expression a mix of worry and hope. "Jake, come here," Susan called, waving him over. Walter turned, smiling warmly at Jake. "Hey, Jake," he said, his voice as kind as before. Jake nodded, giving a small smile. "Hi." Walter gestured towards the apartment. "Shall we go inside? I'd like to talk a bit more about what we can do." They went inside, and Walter took a seat at the kitchen table, laying out a few papers in front of him. He looked at Susan, his expression serious. "I know it's a big decision, and I want you both to feel comfortable with whatever we decide." Susan nodded, her eyes scanning the papers. "You're really sure about this? Helping us like this?" Walter leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. "I am. I want to make a difference where I can. And what Jake did, it reminded me of why I started this in the first place. I was in a similar situation once and someone helped me. I just want to pass that forward." Jake listened, his heart pounding. He looked at the papers, seeing words like education sponsorship and employment opportunity. It was real. This could be the chance they needed. But it still felt like a dream, something too good to be true. Susan's fingers trembled as she signed her name at the bottom of the page, her eyes glistening. She looked up at Walter. "Thank you. Really. I don't know how to—" Walter waved his hand gently. "You don't need to thank me. Just take this opportunity and make the best of it. That's all I want." Jake watched as his mom handed the papers back to Walter, her hands steadying as she let go. For the first time in a long while, he saw something different in her eyes, hope that wasn't clouded by fear. "Jake," Walter said, turning to him, "I've arranged for you to start in a special after-school program. It's focused on giving kids a head start in areas they're interested in. I think it'll be good for you. You've got potential, more than you realize." Jake swallowed, nodding slowly. "Okay, I'll do my best." Walter smiled. That's all anyone can ask. After Walter left, Jake and his mom sat at the kitchen table in silence for a while. The papers were still there, a tangible sign of change. Jake looked at his mom, seeing her smile for real, the tension in her shoulders loosening. "Maybe this is it, Jake," she said softly. "Maybe things are finally going to get better." Jake nodded, feeling the knot in his chest start to unwind, just a little. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was the beginning of something different, something good. He stood up, heading to his small room. He needed to get ready for tomorrow, for whatever this new opportunity would bring. He still wasn't sure what was waiting for him, but for the first time, he felt like maybe it wasn't just another struggle. Maybe it was something worth fighting for. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Jake woke up. The usual hum of the streets was muffled, and his sister Anna was still asleep in the room beside his. He got dressed quickly, sliding into his worn-out sneakers, ready to face the day. The new program Walter had mentioned was starting today, and though there was a hint of nervousness bubbling inside, there was also a feeling he wasn't used to. Anticipation. His mother had made an effort with breakfast that morning. She had found some eggs and made scrambled eggs on toast, smiling a bit more easily than usual. Jake sat at the kitchen table taking a bite of the toast, feeling the warmth of the food filling him up, even though it was simple. "Big day today, Jake," his mom said, sitting across from him. "You're going to do great, just remember that." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't sure what to expect from the after-school program, but if Walter thought it would help, maybe it really could be the start of something different, something better. Susan gave him a hug at the door, her arms wrapping around him tightly. "Remember, I'm proud of you no matter what, okay?" she said, her voice soft. Jake gave her a nod, trying to ignore the prickling feeling in his chest. He picked up his bag and started down the street. As he turned the corner, the familiar sights greeted him. The same cracked sidewalks, the worn-out cars, and the few people who were already up, heading off to work. But something felt different today. There was a purpose in his steps, a sense that maybe things could finally start to change. School passed by in a blur of lessons and scribbled notes. When lunch arrived, Jake found his usual seat in the corner of the cafeteria, opening his lunchbox. Today he had a sandwich, 2 slices of bread, thin with some peanut butter in between. It wasn't much, but it was more than what he usually had, and for that, he was grateful. Mark showed up, dropping his tray down and sliding into the seat across from Jake. "Hey man, heard you're starting some after-school thing?" Mark asked, his mouth full of pizza. Jake nodded, not wanting to say too much. The last thing he needed was more attention. "Yeah, it's something Walter set up. He thinks it'll help." Mark raised an eyebrow, his expression somewhere between impressed and skeptical. "That guy seems to have it all figured out. I mean, good for you, right? You gotta take what you can get." Jake forced a smile, but it felt hollow. He could feel the weight of Mark's words. Take what you can get. It made it sound like he was just lucky, like he hadn't earned any of this. But wasn't that what everyone was thinking? As school ended, Jake made his way to the designated building where the program was being held. It was a community center a few blocks from the school, a squat brick building that had seen better days. Jake walked in, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, his heart pounding a little harder. There were about 10 other kids in the room, sitting in a circle. They looked up as he walked in, and he could feel the curiosity in their eyes. He took a seat in one of the empty chairs, glancing around. A man in his mid-30s stood at the front, his expression warm and inviting. "Hey everyone," the man said, clapping his hands together. "Glad to see some new faces today. My name's Mr. Carter, and I'm going to be leading this program for the next few weeks. We're here to work on some skills, learn some new things, and most importantly, help you guys build a future you can be proud of." Jake nodded, trying to push away the nervousness gnawing at his stomach. Mr. Carter seemed friendly enough, but there was something about being in a room full of strangers that made him feel out of place. As the session went on, they worked through a few exercises, introducing themselves, talking about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Jake listened as the other kids spoke. Some of them wanted to be doctors, others engineers. Jake swallowed when it was his turn. I don't know yet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting, and he forced himself to say something more. "I just want to help my family." Mr. Carter nodded, smiling warmly. "That's a good goal, Jake. A very good goal." Jake felt his face flush as he sat back, his shoulders tensing. He wanted to believe that what he was doing here could make a difference, but a part of him still wondered if it was enough. After the program ended, Jake walked home, his mind buzzing with everything that had happened. The other kids were nice enough, and Mr. Carter seemed like he genuinely wanted to help them. But when Jake thought about his mom, about their overdue rent and the landlord's threats, it all still felt so heavy. When he reached his building, he stopped short. The landlord's car was parked out front, his figure looming near the door, his hands gesturing animatedly as he talked to Jake's mom. Jake's stomach dropped, and he hurried forward. "Mom!" Jake called out, catching Susan's attention. She turned, her face tight, her eyes widening when she saw Jake. "It's fine, Jake," she said quickly, but Jake could hear the tremor in her voice. The landlord, a stocky man with a permanent scowl, glanced at Jake, his eyes narrowing. "You need to pay what you owe, Susan. I'm not going to wait forever," he said, his voice gruff. Jake stepped closer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "We're working on it. Just give us a little more time." The landlord shook his head, his expression hardening. "I've given you time, kid. If you think some fancy guy showing up is going to change the rules, you're wrong. If anything, it just makes me think you've got more to give." Jake felt his chest tighten, the anger bubbling up. "We don't have anything more," he snapped. "We're just trying to make it." The landlord's gaze shifted, a sneer curling his lips. "Well, you better figure it out fast. You've got until the end of the week. After that, I want you out." Jake watched as the landlord turned and walked away, his mother's face pale and strained. She looked at Jake, her eyes glistening. "I'm so sorry, Jake," she whispered. "I don't know what else to do." Jake stepped forward, wrapping his arms around his mom. He could feel her trembling, the weight of everything pressing down on her. "We're going to figure it out, Mom. We'll talk to Walter. He'll know what to do." Susan nodded, her breath hitching as she hugged Jake back. They stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at their skin, the world around them feeling like it was closing in. But Jake held on, trying to push away the fear that threatened to swallow him whole. That night, Jake lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The landlord's words echoed in his head, the threat of losing everything they had. He thought of Walter, of the after-school program, of everything they were trying to do to make things better. But it felt like no matter how hard they tried, there was always something standing in their way. He clenched his jaw, determination slowly rising inside him. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. He would talk to Walter, find a way to keep their home, to make things right. He wasn't going to let his mom cry herself to sleep anymore. He wasn't going to let the landlord bully them into the street. Tomorrow, he would talk to Walter. He would do whatever it took to protect his family, to make sure they didn't lose the little they had left. He had to. There was no other choice. Jake woke up the next morning with a plan in his head. He had to talk to Walter. The landlord's ultimatum loomed over them, and he needed to know if there was anything they could do. He dressed quickly, the urgency making him feel restless. He could hear his mom in the kitchen, her movements slow and weary. Jake entered the kitchen and saw her sitting at the table, staring down at a bill, her hands resting limply on either side. Her eyes were red, and it was clear she hadn't slept well. Jake took a deep breath, walking over to her and gently touching her shoulder. "Mom," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm going to talk to Walter today. We're not alone in this." Susan looked up, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "Jake, I don't want you to feel like you have to fix everything, okay? You're just a kid." Jake shook his head, his jaw tight. "I know, but we're a team, right? And I'm not going to let that landlord push us out." He paused, then added, "Walter wants to help. We should let him." His mother nodded slowly, her lips pressing together in a weak smile. "Okay, Jake. Just be careful, all right? We don't know how much someone like Walter can really do for us." Jake nodded, picking up his backpack. He hugged her tightly before heading out the door, the cold morning air hitting his face as soon as he stepped outside. He walked quickly, the thought of Walter's help giving him a sense of direction. He needed to believe that this was their way out. School passed by in a blur. Jake could barely focus on his lessons, his thoughts consumed by what he needed to do after class. When the final bell rang, he wasted no time, heading straight to the community center where Walter had set up the after-school program. He hoped Walter would be there today. When Jake arrived, he spotted Walter talking with Mr. Carter near the entrance. Walter looked up as Jake approached, his face breaking into a smile. "Jake, good to see you. How was school today?" Jake tried to smile back, but it felt tight. "It was all right," he said, his eyes flicking to Mr. Carter. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Walter nodded, excusing himself from his conversation with Mr. Carter. He gestured for Jake to follow him to a quiet corner of the building. "What's on your mind, Jake?" Jake swallowed, trying to find the right words. "It's about the landlord. He came by again. He's giving us until the end of the week to pay what we owe, or he's going to kick us out." His voice cracked a little as he spoke, the fear he'd been holding back all day finally slipping through. "I don't know what else to do." Walter's expression softened, his eyes filled with sympathy. He reached out, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Jake, I'm really sorry to hear that. But listen, you don't have to face this alone. I can help you and your mom get through this." Jake nodded, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. "But the landlord, he doesn't care about us. He thinks just because you showed up that we have money now, and he wants more from us." Walter sighed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Some people will always try to take advantage of a situation like this. It's not fair, and it's not right." He paused, considering for a moment. "I can speak with him, Jake. I have some contacts that may be able to help put some pressure on him. We won't let him push you out." Jake's shoulders relaxed, a sense of hope filling his chest. "You really think we can stop him?" Walter smiled, giving Jake's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I know we can. You just focus on school and this program, all right? Let me worry about the landlord." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in a different way now, a sense of relief that maybe finally things would be okay. "Thank you, Walter. I don't know how to thank you enough." Walter shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're a good kid, Jake. You and your mom deserve a fair shot. Now go on and join the program today. We'll get through this." Jake gave Walter one last grateful look before heading into the room where the other kids were gathering. Mr. Carter was already at the front, getting ready to start the session. Jake took a seat, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The session started with Mr. Carter asking everyone to share something positive that had happened recently. Jake listened as the other kids shared small victories, a good grade, a fun weekend, getting to spend time with their family. When it was his turn, Jake paused for a moment, then spoke up. "I think we're going to be okay at home," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "We've been having trouble with our landlord, but someone's helping us now. I think we're going to be all right." Mr. Carter smiled, nodding. "That's great, Jake. It's good to hear you're feeling hopeful. Remember, there's always help out there. You just have to be brave enough to ask for it." Jake nodded, feeling the words sink in. Maybe that was true. Maybe just asking for help could change everything. The rest of the session went by smoothly, and for the first time, Jake felt like he was part of something bigger, like he wasn't alone in his struggles. As the day ended, Jake walked home with a newfound sense of determination. He knew they had a long way to go, but with Walter's help, maybe they really could get out from under the landlord's threats. When he reached home, he found his mom waiting by the window, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Jake!" she called, opening the door before he even reached it. "How did it go? Did you talk to Walter?" Jake nodded, stepping inside. "Yeah, I did. He said he's going to help. He's going to talk to the landlord and make sure we don't get kicked out." Susan's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so scared." Jake hugged her, holding her close. "I know, Mom, but we're not alone anymore. We've got help." They stayed like that for a moment, the weight of everything easing just a little. Jake could feel his mom's breath against his shoulder, her grip on him slowly loosening as the tension drained from her body. For the first time in a long while, they both felt like maybe things were finally looking up. That night, they sat together at the small kitchen table, talking about what might come next. Walter's offer for her to receive job training had already started taking shape. Susan had been talking with someone Walter knew about some courses she could take, things that could help her get a stable job. It wasn't a big change, not yet, but it was something to hold on to. "Maybe in a few weeks I could start working at a proper office," Susan said, her eyes bright with the thought. "Something that pays enough for us to finally catch up." Jake smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Mom, and maybe I can help more too, with the program and with school." Susan reached across the table, taking Jake's hand in hers. "You're already doing more than enough, Jake. I'm so proud of you. You know that, right?" Jake nodded, his throat feeling tight. "I just want us to be okay." "We will be," Susan said softly. "We will be." The next day, Jake went to school feeling a sense of hope that was unfamiliar but welcome. Even when he heard whispers about the fancy car again, he didn't let it bother him as much. Mark caught up to him in the hallway, a grin on his face. "So, any updates on the rich guy?" Mark asked, nudging Jake's shoulder. Jake shrugged. "He's just helping out, he's a good guy." Mark nodded, still curious. "Well, if you end up with a mansion or something, don't forget to invite me over." Jake smiled a little, shaking his head. "It's not like that, it's just, he's helping us get through this, that's all." Mark patted Jake's back. "Hey, whatever it is, I'm happy for you, man. Not everyone gets a break like that." Jake nodded, the words sitting with him. It was true. Not everyone got a break, but he had, and he wasn't going to waste it. When he went to the after-school program later that day, Jake felt more determined than ever. He wanted to make the most of this chance, not just for himself, but for his mom, for Anna, for the life they deserved. He sat up straighter, paid more attention, participated more. He wanted to show Walter, Mr. Carter, and himself that he was worth investing in. When Jake returned home that evening, he found his mom in the kitchen, a smile on her face. "Guess what, Jake?" she said, her eyes sparkling. "Walter called. He talked to the landlord. We're not getting kicked out. He convinced him to give us more time." Jake felt a rush of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. He hugged his mom tightly, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "We did it, Mom. We're going to be okay." Susan nodded, her smile trembling but bright. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, Jake believed it. They still had a long road ahead, but they weren't alone anymore. They had hope, and they had help. And that was enough. The following morning started with a sense of determination in the air. Jake woke up earlier than usual. He stretched, feeling the tension in his shoulders that had been building for days start to ease. For once, he felt like he wasn't just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. He was actually doing something about it. His mom was already awake, making coffee in the small kitchen. When Jake stepped out of his room, she looked over and smiled, the worry lines around her eyes softening. "Morning, Jake. Breakfast is almost ready," she said. Jake walked over, grabbing a plate and taking a slice of toast. "Thanks, Mom. You look happy today." Susan smiled, her expression bright despite the lingering exhaustion. "I am. It's been a while since I felt like we had a real chance, you know." She paused, turning to look at Jake more seriously. "I want to say thank you, Jake. You've been so strong. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you." Jake swallowed, his throat feeling tight. He nodded, trying to hide how much her words affected him. "We're in this together, Mom." Susan reached out, patting his arm. "Yes, we are." After breakfast, Jake grabbed his bag, his mind buzzing with what was to come. Today was the day he was going to face the landlord, not alone, but with Walter by his side. Walter had arranged a meeting with the landlord, and it would be the first time Jake felt like they actually had a fighting chance. At school, Jake tried his best to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting to the meeting later that day. He imagined what it would be like, standing in front of the landlord, telling him that they weren't going to be bullied anymore, that they had support, that they weren't just some family he could push around. During lunch, Mark sat down across from Jake, his expression curious. "You seem kind of quiet today. Everything okay?" he asked, taking a bite of his sandwich. Jake looked up, shrugging. "Yeah, it's just, we've got a big meeting later today, with our landlord." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Really? What's it about?" Jake sighed. "He's been trying to force us out, but Walter's going to help us talk to him. Make sure he knows we're not just going to give up." Mark gave a nod of understanding, his face serious. "That's brave, man. I hope it goes well." Jake gave a small smile. "Yeah, me too." The school day eventually came to an end, and Jake hurried to the community center where Walter had told them to meet. His stomach felt like it was twisted in knots, but he kept reminding himself why they were doing this. It was for his mom, for Anna, for their home. When Jake arrived, Walter was already there, standing near the entrance, his expression calm. He gave Jake a nod, a reassuring smile on his face. "You ready for this, Jake?" Jake took a deep breath, nodding. "Yeah, I'm ready." They walked together to Jake's apartment building. The landlord's car was already parked out front, the familiar scowl etched on his face as he stood by the doorway, arms crossed. Susan was waiting inside, her face tense but resolute. When she saw them, she stepped out, her eyes meeting Jake's, and she gave a small nod. The landlord looked up, his expression shifting as he saw Walter approach. There was a flicker of something, maybe surprise, maybe annoyance in his eyes. "What's this?" he grumbled, his gaze narrowing. "What are you all doing here?" Walter stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to have a conversation about Susan and Jake's tenancy. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about their situation, and I want to make sure we clear it up." The landlord snorted, his eyes moving to Jake and Susan, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Misunderstanding? There's no misunderstanding. They're behind on rent. That's all there is to it." Jake felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He stepped forward, his voice louder than he intended. "We're not just going to let you bully us anymore. We're trying to make it, and we've got help now. You don't get to treat us like we're nothing." Walter placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, a silent gesture to steady him. He turned back to the landlord, his voice steady. "You have a legal responsibility to provide reasonable accommodations and not use intimidation tactics. Jake and his family have been doing everything they can to catch up on rent, and they now have financial backing to help them get back on track. There's no reason for any eviction, and I'd advise you to reconsider your stance." The landlord's face flushed, his scowl deepening. "Financial backing, huh? You think just because you've got some money, you can come in here and tell me how to run my building?" Walter didn't flinch. He met the landlord's gaze evenly. "I'm not here to tell you how to run your building. I'm here to ensure that this family is treated fairly. They deserve respect, just like any other tenant." The landlord opened his mouth as if to argue, but then he seemed to hesitate. He looked at Jake, then at Susan, and finally back at Walter. His shoulders sagged slightly, the bluster draining out of him. "Fine," he muttered, his voice gruff. "I'll give them more time. But they better keep up with the payments. I'm not running a charity here." Walter nodded, his expression remaining calm. "That's all we're asking for. Fair treatment." The landlord grumbled something under his breath before turning and walking away, his footsteps heavy as he stomped to his car. Jake watched him leave, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. He turned to Walter, his voice shaky. Did that really just happen?" Walter smiled, patting Jake's shoulder. "It did. You stood up for yourself, Jake. You did good." Susan stepped forward, her eyes glistening as she looked at Walter. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Walter shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You both deserve this. You've worked hard, and you're not alone anymore." Jake looked at his mom, seeing the tears in her eyes, the relief that seemed to make her shoulders lighter. He felt a lump in his throat, his heart pounding. For the first time, it felt like they had won, like they had actually made a difference. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice steadying, "for everything." Walter nodded, giving them both a warm smile. "This is just the beginning, Jake. You've got a lot ahead of you, but I know you're going to do great things. Keep that strength." As Walter walked away, Jake and his mom stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Susan turned to Jake, her eyes filled with pride. "You were amazing, Jake. You really stood up for us." Jake shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I couldn't let him keep treating us like that." Susan pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapping tightly around him. "I'm so proud of you." That night, there was a different feeling in their small apartment. The air felt lighter, the tension that had been looming over them for so long finally lifting. They ate dinner together, soup and bread, nothing fancy, but it felt like a celebration. Anna giggled as she told a story from school, her laughter echoing in the small kitchen. Susan smiled, nodding along, her eyes filled with warmth. Jake watched them both, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Later, as Jake lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything that had happened. He had stood up to the landlord, he had faced his fears, and they had won. They weren't out of the woods yet. There was still a lot to do, still a lot of struggles ahead. But for once, it felt like they had a fighting chance. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. They were going to be okay. Maybe not perfect, maybe not easy, but okay. And that was enough. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains, filling Jake's room with a soft light that felt more like hope than anything he had felt in a long time. He got out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floor as he rubbed his eyes. Today felt different, lighter somehow. Jake could hear the faint clatter of pans in the kitchen. His mom was already up, making breakfast. Jake entered the kitchen to find his mom standing at the stove, cooking scrambled eggs, the smell wafting through the room. She turned when she saw him, her smile genuine and bright. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been missing for too long. "I thought we could have a proper breakfast today, since things are finally looking up." Jake nodded, grabbing a plate and sitting at the small table. "Thanks, Mom. It smells really good." Susan turned back to the stove, her movements relaxed, almost happy. "Walter called this morning," she said over her shoulder. "He said he spoke to someone about those job training courses. Looks like I can start as soon as next week." Jake's eyes widened, his heart swelling with hope. "Really? That's amazing, Mom." She nodded, turning back around and setting the plate of eggs in front of him. "It is, isn't it? I think things might actually be getting better, Jake. Really better." Jake picked up his fork, his chest feeling light for the first time in what seemed like forever. They ate together in the quiet of the morning, savoring the small victory. The food tasted different today, not just because it was more than they usually had, but because it felt like the beginning of something new. After breakfast, Jake grabbed his backpack and headed out the door, waving at his mom as he left. He walked down the familiar streets, the cracks in the sidewalk and the worn-out buildings all the same as before, but somehow they didn't seem quite so daunting today. There was a bounce in his step, and for once, he allowed himself to smile without holding back. At school, Jake could feel the difference in the way he carried himself. When he walked into his classroom, Mark called out to him, waving him over. Jake slid into the seat next to him, the usual feeling of anxiety replaced by something calmer. "So, how'd it go yesterday?" Mark asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Jake shrugged, though he couldn't hide the smile that tugged at his lips. "It went better than I expected. Walter talked to the landlord and he backed off. We're not getting kicked out." Mark let out a low whistle, nodding in approval. "Man, that's awesome. I knew you could do it." Jake smiled, feeling a warmth settle in his chest. "Thanks, Mark. It's still going to be tough, but at least we've got a chance now." Mark nodded, slapping Jake on the back. "You'll make it, man. I know you will." The day passed quickly, and when the final bell rang, Jake made his way to the community center for the after-school program. Today he felt more excited than nervous, like he was ready to take on whatever was coming. When he walked in, Mr. Carter was already there, setting up some papers and materials at the front of the room. Jake took his usual seat, glancing around at the other kids who were slowly trickling in. He felt different now, like he belonged here, like he was part of something that mattered. Mr. Carter started the session by talking about their goals, what they wanted to achieve, what steps they could take to get there. Jake listened closely, his mind buzzing with possibilities. When it was his turn to share, he took a deep breath, trying to put his thoughts into words. "I want to help my family," Jake began, his voice steady. "But I want to learn more. I want to be able to do something that matters. I don't know exactly what that is yet, but I want to figure it out." Mr. Carter nodded, his eyes warm. "That's a great goal, Jake. And you know what? I think you're already on your way." Jake smiled, a sense of pride filling him. For the first time, he felt like he was allowed to dream, to think about a future that wasn't just about surviving from day to day. He wanted to make something of himself, not just for his mom and Anna, but for himself too. As the session ended, Mr. Carter pulled Jake aside, his expression kind but serious. "Jake, I wanted to tell you, you're doing great here. I see a lot of potential in you. If you keep working hard, there's no limit to what you can achieve." Jake swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot." Mr. Carter patted his shoulder, giving him an encouraging nod. "Keep at it, Jake. You've got this." Jake left the community center with a lightness in his step, the words still echoing in his head. He walked home, feeling like the future wasn't just a dark, uncertain place anymore. It was something he could shape, something he could reach out and take. When he reached home, his mom was waiting in the living room, her face lighting up when she saw him. "How was the program today?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Jake smiled, dropping his bag onto the floor. "It was good. Mr. Carter said I'm doing well. He thinks I have potential." Susan's eyes softened, tears welling up as she reached out to hug him. "Of course you do, Jake. You've always had potential. You're such a smart, strong boy." Jake hugged her back, feeling her warmth, her love, surrounding him. I want to make you proud, Mom." "You already do, Jake," Susan whispered, her voice breaking. "Every single day." The next week passed in a blur of new beginnings. Susan started her job training, her schedule shifting as she began to learn skills that could help her get a better job. Jake could see the difference it made in her, how her eyes seemed brighter, how her posture was a little straighter. She was hopeful, and that hope was contagious. Jake continued with the after-school program, putting his heart into every session. He wanted to make the most of this chance, not just for himself, but for his mom and Anna too. He was learning new things, exploring ideas he had never considered before. For the first time, he was thinking about what he wanted to be, what he could do if he really tried. At school, things were changing too. The whispers about the rich guy who had come to his house were slowly fading. Kids were starting to see Jake differently, not as the kid who was always struggling, but as someone who was working hard to make a difference. Mark stuck by his side, always ready with an encouraging word, and Jake found himself opening up more, letting people in. One day after school, as they were walking home, Mark turned to Jake, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Jake, I think you're going to do some pretty great things." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "I don't know about that. I'm just trying to figure things out like everyone else." Mark nudged him with his elbow. "Nah, man. You're different. You've been through stuff and you're still here, still fighting. That's something special." Jake looked down at the sidewalk, his chest tightening. He didn't always feel special. Most of the time, he just felt like he was doing what he had to do. But maybe Mark was right. Maybe there was something in him that was worth believing in. When Jake got home that evening, he found his mom sitting at the kitchen table, a piece of paper in her hand. She looked up, her eyes shining as she waved him over. "Jake, look at this," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Jake walked over, taking the paper from her. It was an acceptance letter, a confirmation that his mom had been accepted into the training program, that she was officially starting her journey towards a better job. Jake looked up, his eyes meeting his mom's. "Mom, this is amazing. You did it." Susan smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We did it, Jake. We're doing this together." They hugged, the weight of everything they had been through slowly starting to lift. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were finally moving forward, finally seeing a way out of the darkness that had hung over them for so long. That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts buzzing with hope and possibility. He thought about everything that had happened, about Walter's help, about his mom's new beginning, about the after-school program that was opening doors for him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something better, something that they could be proud of. He closed his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. The future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges. But for the first time, Jake wasn't afraid of it. He was ready. He was ready to face whatever came next, to fight for his family, to make something of himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Jake woke up early, even before the sun had fully risen. There was something about this morning that felt different, more purposeful. He lay in bed for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of the blankets wrapped around him. He heard the faint sounds of his mom in the kitchen, getting ready for her training program. He smiled, knowing that today was one of the first real steps she would be taking towards their new future. He got out of bed and walked into the kitchen, where his mom was sitting at the table, flipping through some notes she had taken. She looked up when she saw Jake, her face lighting up with a smile that reached her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with a brightness that made the whole room feel lighter. "I made some toast for you. It's not much, but..." Jake waved his hand, shaking his head. "It's perfect, Mom. You didn't have to do that." Susan chuckled, pushing the plate towards him. "Nonsense. You've got a big day too, you know. I hear Mr. Carter's got something special planned for you, all at the community center." Jake took a bite of the toast, nodding as he chewed. "Yeah, he said we're going to be working on some group projects. I'm kinda excited about it." His mom's eyes softened, and she reached out, brushing a lock of his hair back. "I'm proud of you, Jake, the way you've stepped up, everything you're doing. I want you to know that you're my hero." Jake swallowed, his throat tightening. He looked down at the toast, blinking away the tears that threatened to rise. "I'm just trying to help, Mom." Susan nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. And you are more than you know. They finished breakfast together, and then it was time for his mom to leave for her training. She hugged Jake tightly before she left, whispering, "We're gonna make it, Jake. I know we will." Jake hugged her back, his heart swelling with emotion. "I know, Mom. We're doing this together." After his mom left, Jake grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The walk to school felt lighter today, like the weight he had been carrying for so long was finally lifting. He passed by the same old cracked sidewalks, the worn fences, but it all looked different somehow. There was hope now, where there hadn't been before. School went by quickly, and before he knew it, Jake was on his way to the community center. He was excited about the group project. Mr. Carter had been talking about it for a week now, and Jake was curious about what they would be doing. When he arrived, he found Mr. Carter standing at the front of the room, a whiteboard behind him covered in writing. "All right, everyone," Mr. Carter called, clapping his hands together. "Today we're going to be working on something a little different. We're going to talk about what it means to give back to our community." Jake sat up straighter, his curiosity piqued. He watched as Mr. Carter started writing on the board, words like community, giving back, and future taking shape. "I want each of you to think about one thing you can do to make a difference," Mr. Carter said, turning to face the group. "It doesn't have to be big. It can be something small, something that shows you care. I want you to work in groups, come up with an idea, and then we'll present them at the end." Jake was paired with two other kids, Maria and David. Maria was quiet, her eyes downcast, while David was a bit more outspoken, his voice carrying across the room as they moved their chairs into a small circle. "So, what do you think?" David asked, looking between Jake and Maria. "What can we do to help our community?" Jake thought for a moment, his eyes drifting to the window. He remembered the old man he had given his lunch to, the way he had looked, the way it had felt to give, even when he had barely anything himself. That small moment had changed everything, not just for him, but for his entire family. He looked back at David and Maria, a small smile tugging at his lips. "What if we did something to help people who are struggling?" he said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "Like, maybe we could collect food or supplies for people who need it." Maria looked up, her eyes brightening. "That's a good idea. My mom always says we should help people if we can. Maybe we could ask the other kids at school to donate too." David nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I like that. We could put up posters, get the word out. Make it a real project." Jake felt a surge of excitement, his heart pounding in his chest. They spent the rest of the session working on their plan, sketching out ideas for how they could collect donations, how they could get more people involved. It wasn't anything huge, but it was something that could make a real difference. When it was time to present, Jake stood up with Maria and David, his heart pounding as they walked to the front of the room. He looked at Mr. Carter, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then he turned to face the rest of the group. "We want to start a collection drive," Jake began, his voice steady. "For people in our neighborhood who need help. It could be food, supplies, whatever we can get. We want to make sure that people know they're not alone." Maria and David nodded beside him, and Jake could see the interest in the eyes of the other kids. Mr. Carter smiled, stepping forward and placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "That's a wonderful idea, Jake," he said, his voice warm. "It's exactly the kind of thing we need more of, people looking out for each other, even when times are tough." Jake felt his chest swell with pride as they returned to their seats. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, not just for his family, but for others too. After the session ended, Mr. Carter pulled Jake aside, his eyes kind. "You know, Jake, when I first met you, I could tell you had a lot of strength. But today, I saw something even more important. You have heart, and that's what's going to take you far." Jake swallowed, his throat tightening. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I want to help." Mr. Carter nodded, giving Jake's shoulder a squeeze. "And you are. You're helping more than you know." Jake walked home that evening with a smile on his face, his heart light. He felt like he had a purpose now, something beyond just making it through each day. He wanted to help others, just like Walter had helped him, just like Mr. Carter believed he could. When he got home, his mom was waiting at the kitchen table, a small stack of papers in front of her. She looked up when Jake walked in, her face breaking into a smile. "Jake, I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I got the job. The training worked, and they offered me a position. It's not much, but it's steady work, and it means we can finally start saving." Jake's eyes widened, his heart swelling with emotion. He rushed over, wrapping his arms around his mom, holding her tightly. "Mom, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." Susan hugged him back, her voice breaking. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jake. You gave me hope when I had none left." Jake pulled back, looking into her eyes, seeing the pride and love there. "We did this together, Mom, and we're going to keep going." That night they celebrated with a simple dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, but it felt like a feast. They laughed, they talked about the future, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so scary. It felt like something they could look forward to. As Jake lay in bed later that night, staring up at the ceiling, he thought about everything that had happened. The struggles, the fear, the uncertainty. It had all brought them here, to this moment of hope. And it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about making a difference, about giving back. He closed his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips. He thought about Walter, about Mr. Carter, about the community he was now a part of. He thought about his mom, about Anna, about the life they were building. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Tomorrow he would go to school, he would go to the community center, he would keep working, keep fighting, keep helping, because that was who he was. And he knew now, without a doubt, that he could make a difference. He could be the change, and that was just the beginning.